in like less than an hour for sure, we'll kind of cover some ground on visual abstract, sort of the what, the how, and the why. To just tell you a little bit about myself, I kind of live with three pretty different perspectives. The first is I'm a surgeon. So I'm a general surgeon in the University of Michigan. I operate every week, and that's kind of the core of my identity as a frontline care provider. I'm also a formally trained health services researcher. So I've done two formal fellowships, including a master's degree in policy evaluation and health policy and health services. And so write tons of papers, think about research all the time, write grants all the time. And of course, before I did all that, I studied architecture. So before I went to medical school, I spent time at the Bartlett in London, subsequently got involved with the American Institute of Architects and their design and health committees. And so even though I've thought about health a lot in that space, it wasn't lost on me that the way designers think and present and talk about health was different. And that really impacted what came to be the visual abstract. Before I go too far into the content of the work, I just want to say we are in unusual times for the last almost year. And I love my job, I love operating, and I love being there, and I love research and writing papers. But whatever you're doing, as much as you love that, just be kind to yourself. Take some time to get outdoors, go listen to live music, hang out with your friends, do the things that you also really care about that help you stay centered about who you are and that you care about. So anyway, there will be reference a couple times to the Visual Abstract Primer, which is available for free to download at surgerydesign.com. On that website, there is also a free primer about how to write a research article, which I think is probably relevant to this group as well. But I only mention it because I think some of the themes also reproduce themselves and may be kind of relevant to you. So let's dive into visual abstracts. I'll tell you a little bit of the game plan. I'll tell you the backstory about how visual abstracts came to be. I'll tell you a little bit about the impact that they've been having and how they've been used. I will walk you through some templates and just show you, and we'll pause throughout it, how like I think about a visual abstract, what are some of the design principles, and what are the things I think through while I'm doing it. And then I'll tell you a little bit about kind of like how it's being adapted or how it's being used going forward as a way for you to kind of brainstorm about it. So what is a visual abstract? A visual abstract is a visual representation of the main findings typically found in the abstract portion of a research article. Now that's like the number one violation defining something is like using the word in the definition. So it's probably easier if I just show you. So this is a visual abstract from the New England Journal of Medicine. That was a randomized trial for glioblastoma showing dual therapy versus monotherapy, and found that overall median survival was better in the dual free group. This was a survey done in the Annals of Surgery of 1,000 surgeons asking about their barriers to becoming surgical scientists. And the three most common complaints on the survey were pressure to be clinically productive, excessive administrative duties, and concern about work-life balance. This is a piece in the Annals of Internal Medicine that was actually an opinion piece, not a research article, that was comparing hospital and airport design and identify these 5 elements of airports that we could potentially bring into hospitals. And then finally, this is one from the CDC that was almost like a public service announcement, letting people know that in this research they did from their data, 6 out of 10 middle school students and 7 out of 10 high school students don't get enough sleep during the week. Now, in about 1 minute, I told you about 4 research studies. Now, by no means are you an expert in any of those studies. However, if you only had time to read one of those articles, you are now much better positioned to actually do that. And so I think of it almost like a movie trailer. Like this is like the preview to the article to help you quickly kind of digest what it's about and as if there's something that you want to go spend more time on. So how do you find a visual abstract? For the most part, it's been about 2 years now. They live in social media predominantly. So when you go to the journal sites, that is where you often find them. New England Journal has gone so far as to make a database of all their visual abstracts. JAMA and the JAMA network has actually integrated the visual abstract right into the article. So if a visual abstract exists for it, it'll have its own icon, and it'll be under the tables and figures. So really just integrated right into the work. So how did this come to be? So as I kind of alluded to briefly in the beginning, I studied in London for some time before going to medical school. And this is just one of like the most famous kind of intersection crosswalks. And it makes you chuckle a little bit if you are from America, because it tells you to look both ways, because traffic in England is on the opposite side of the road than what Americans are used to. And so it can be very unsettling that see traffic coming from the opposite direction when you're trying to cross the road. So I remember my British friends kind of laughing at me about it and sort of chuckling and maybe making fun of Americans a little bit. And I remember remarking to them, you know, heaven forbid something should happen. We live in London. It's one of the best metropolitan cities in the world. Surely I'd be taken to a good hospital and get world-class care. And they kind of chuckled a little bit, and I didn't really understand why until about a decade later. So at that point, I'd gone to medical school. I've done some surgical training. I've done some research work, and I come across this article. It was called The Impact of Pan-Regional Inclusive Trauma System on Quality of Care. It was an article describing that London had actually not established a coordinated trauma system until about 2010. And this was an evaluation of it. Now, looking back and thinking, how is it possible that a city as advanced and developed as London didn't have a coordinated trauma system? So when I saw this article, I thought, oh my gosh, this is groundbreaking work. Like everyone should care about this. It's really important. And so I went to the editors of Annals of Surgery. One of the editors was one of my mentors. And I said, we got to share this article. And so I got permission to use their social media account. And I was so excited. I thought, you know, if only this was shared on social media, it would get some traction. So I shared the text abstract of this article. It got seen 2,000 times. 8 people thought it was so compelling that they went on to share it. And the article got visited 81 times. And I thought, so frustrating. Like, this article is so good. If only people knew quickly what it was about, they would know this is an article they need to go read. And so became the birth of the visual abstract. And this was the first one. And this was really just my attempt to try to summarize the key findings of that article in a way that could get read quicker, just to help alert people to the article. So London Trauma, after establishing an inclusive coordinated trauma system, access to a trauma specialist on first arrival went from 16 to 84%. Involvement of a senior clinician within the first 30 minutes went from 38 to 92%. And improved survival in the critically ill went from 69 to 89%. So what happened when that got shared on social media? It got seen much more. In 2 weeks, it was seen nearly 35,000 times. 169 people went on to reshare it in their networks. And the article got visited over 250 times. Now, as someone who thinks a lot about my own, about my own research, that really like means a lot to me, that the article, that people are actually going to go read the work, thinking, knowing how much time I as researchers spend on the work. And you start to realize that being able to communicate your work efficiently in a short amount of time in a way that engages people is actually a bit of a superpower. And so I love this quote from Lin-Manuel Miranda, who created and directed Hamilton and starred in it. He said, making words rhyme for a living is one of the greatest joys of my life. And that's a superpower that I've been very conscious of developing. And I think what I took away from that was not about writing and rhyming and superpowers, but that being able to visually communicate research finding is actually a skill that you have to be very conscious of developing. So over the next 2 years, we created over 100 visual abstracts at the Annals of Surgery and disseminated them across the network. But because I'm also a formally trained health services researcher, I wanted to know, is this just a good aesthetic design and I'm just patting myself on the back because I think it looks better? Or could you actually rigorously evaluate this work and learn if it actually makes a difference? So we designed a randomized prospective trial where we took 44 research articles. Half of them were shared as visual abstracts and half were shared as text abstracts. We then waited about a 4-week washout period and then reshared the articles in the opposite version. And then, because we had the same content, we compared each article head to head based on impressions, retweets, and article visits. So what did we find? Not to get too meta on you, but this is a visual abstract summarizing the impact of a visual abstract. So essentially, we were able to reproduce the findings that we found um, during the initial first visual abstract. So impressions went up nearly 8-fold, retweets 8-fold, and article visits. And again, just as someone who spends a lot of time on the work, this isn't a substitute for reading the article, but how satisfying is it as a researcher to know that some investment in design may actually get your work read almost 3 times as much? I think that really resonated with me. So we kind of had to make a decision as an editorial board at the Annals of Surgery. Do we just keep this as a proprietary thing? Do we just say, if you want a visual abstract, you have to publish your work in the Annals of Surgery? Or do we go the opposite and think, hey, this is actually just really good for science and really good for our collective field, and we should just open source it? So we did. The first visual abstract was released about 2 years ago, and it was 9 pages. It's now in its 4th edition and is about 55 pages with 11 co-authors. And we're actually putting together the 5th edition. So I would encourage you that if you are getting into this work and excited about it, and you see things in the visual primer that you think should be added or improved, by all means reach out. We'd love to include it in the next edition. So since we made it open source, we've now had more than 95 journals adopt use of the visual abstract to disseminate their work. Here are some examples: the New England Journal, from the BMJ, and from the CDC. And I think what's particularly exciting is we created templates that show the visual abstract, and I'll talk more about these later. But it was exciting to see these templates actually translate into journals where they could actually put their own brand and their own style to it, but it still maintains some of the core design features that we had originally established. So I kind of thought, can this work outside of surgery and academic work? And so this was the first visual abstract from the CDC, and it was about sleep, topic I don't know that people are clamoring about. But in 2 weeks, they were able to get 1.4 million impressions, 130 shares, but the report got seen more than 13,000 times. So just think about that in terms of work that you really care about, that you want to get to a broad audience. The use of this visual abstract was directly able to link to this report being seen more than 13,000 times. It didn't just go kind of at the level of the CDC, it took on a global level. So in the Philippines, they actually had a visual abstract competition to help stratify which research articles were going to be discussed at that conference. And then this was pretty impactful. I'm glad we have a UK visitor kind of on this call. If I could think of a group of people who are maybe like the most stringent or try to stay within the rules and conventions, I would put Cochrane review people in that cohort. And I was just so surprised and flattered to unsolicited see that they had endorsed visual abstracts and had been teaching it to their people. And then this was also didn't hurt. Getting an endorsement for visual abstract from Atul Gawande certainly helped its adoption. So let me pause for a little bit and just let you take that in. And what I want to move to is tell you what's like the secret sauce. So how do you go from this test abstract that barely disseminates to a visual format where it's getting read quite often. So there are some really important design principles that if you were in a design studio, if you spent time in graduate school in design, these are things that you would get taught and formally trained in. And so I just want to highlight a few. I'll point out that in the Visual Abstract Primer, I walk through a lot more of them, but I'm just going to highlight a handful here. I think one of the keys to a successful visual abstract is really thinking about the end user experience. Who is the audience that you are trying to get your work out to? Is it scientists? Is it the public? Is it clinicians? And if you're sitting at home and you're trying to maybe make a visual abstract kind of during the course of this, I would just jot down some notes on a piece of paper of who do you think your audience is and how would you describe those people? How would you, if you were forced to describe them in 3 words, like what would you say about them? So I'll tell you mine. I did these for academic surgeons. And there are some things about academic surgeons that I think a lot of us self-select for. I think a lot of us are visual people. We work in a craft that is very visual. It's also very technical. We care a lot about details. And we're also busy people. Surgeons don't have a lot of time to read every research article that they want to read. They may have a few minutes in between cases or while between meetings in their office. And so they need something that's efficient. So I kept all those in mind as I was developing visual abstracts. And one of the things we did when we started piloting this is we actually started focus groups and we timed how long does it take you to read a text abstract and how long does it take you to read a visual abstract. So we found that on average, people could read a reasonable text abstract in about 60 seconds. But remarkably, we found that when it came to a visual abstract, people could comfortably read through it in about 6 seconds. So when I think about kind of my audience of a busy academic person, being able to do this totally resonates. And it's just one way you start to develop empathy for what the user experience is going to be on the other side of your design. The next principle of design that I think is great is clarity of purpose. So this is a road out in Colorado between Denver and when you drive up into the hills to go skiing. And what I love about this road is it's so clear. When you're driving on this road, you know exactly where to go. You don't have to turn left. You don't have to turn right. You don't even have to worry about what speed you're going. There's only one thing to do, and it's straight ahead of you. And it makes it like fun, but it's definitely clear. It's a great time I just added this slide this week. This was a quote given to me from a mentee about Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was mentoring her mentees about how to write effectively. She would say, I prefer and continue to aim for opinions that both get it right and keep it tight without undue digressions or decorations. And I think that's an important concept and an important way to express this idea that part of what makes a visual abstract effective is clarity, being incredibly clear with your language and your visuals about what are you trying to say and where do you want people to look. So think about your work or a paper you may be trying to make a visual abstract. Like, what is the message? Like, what are you trying to say in your work? So this was that London paper. I remember I was sitting next to one of my office buddies who is a real technical researcher nerd. And I asked him, I said, hey, how would you describe this article in like one line? And he said, process measures and outcomes of care before and after implementation of a coordinated trauma system in London region for patients experiencing trauma, specifically for patients with an ISS score greater than 25. Now, that's not wrong. I mean, that's true. It's very accurate, but it's not the most clear, concise way to articulate the essence of the idea that you want. So my version of that, after a few iterations, was London trauma after establishing an inclusive coordinated trauma system. Now, if you only have a couple seconds to read a headline, which one of those two things is going to get your attention and resonate with you and increase the odds that you're gonna latch onto that work and keep reading. So if you were doing a visual abstract, I think this is one of the spots where people need to spend a lot of time, is really making clear what is the main message of the work. And so I usually start with something like summarize your work in a paragraph, and that tends to be like the abstract itself. But then push yourself, summarize it in 3 bullets. So if we were kind of doing a formal workshop, I'd have you pause, take an article, just summarize it in 3 bullets. And then what you really want to do is tell a neighbor those 3 bullets. And from just those 3 bullets, do they understand what the article is about? Does that even pass the sniff test? Because if you can't get your content down to 3 accessible short phrases or ideas, the design part and the templates and the icons are all just going to be distractions or decorations, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg would say. So this is like so essential. And I'm always surprised that so many people, when they think about doing visual abstracts, are like, well, I'm not a design person. And it turns out the most important part is actually the prose and getting clarity of purpose about your message. So visual abstracts, this is probably the most popular format. There are about 20 formats that we piloted with focus groups and got down to about 6 that were the most effective, or people knew how to follow the work. And this is probably the most popular one that's been widely adopted. It has a heading at the top that summarizes a key question. It includes the citation and who created the visual abstract, often the journal, but not necessarily. It has some summary of outcomes that includes the outcome comparison, some data to support that outcome, and then a visual display of the outcome. So what I thought would be fun to do is I'll actually just walk through and think out loud with you how I would take this blank slate of a visual abstract template and my thought process about how I would try to fill in an article to do this. So I start with, this is the default template I start with because it's pretty accessible, but you may use one of the different ones. And I actually start pretty simply with just copy and pasting the title into the top and just adding the reference and the journal in the corner. Now I put the journal logo there because I was working as Annals of Surgery at the time. You definitely don't want to use a journal's logo without their permission. And so if you're not representing the journal or work for the journal, then maybe just put your Twitter handle or something. But I start with just very simple, like title, citation. I then rephrase the title. Now, what's written there isn't bad, but it's too much. It's too long. Kind of like that example I showed you before. There's a real value in being both clear and concise. So could I get effectively the information across in less words? So I changed that to the impact of treating iron deficiency anemia before major abdominal surgery. I read through the paper and I thought, what are the 3 main messages that I want to tell someone about this paper? What are the 3 key outcomes or ideas? So I went through and I found those. And the 3 outcomes, or 3 points that I thought were most interesting, were about blood transfusions, length of stay, and hemoglobin change. Now, I told you my audience is technical, like they want to know details. So then what I did is I thought, what is the data that supports those 3 messages? What's the data on blood transfusions, length of stay, and hemoglobin change? So I went through the article and pulled out the specific data points that go with those. And then I added some directionality. So when I showed you that road in Colorado where you're just driving on this beautiful state road, what's beautiful about it is you know exactly where to go. You know exactly how to read it, and you know exactly which direction your eyes should move. If I left it this way, you're not really sure, like, what is the relationship of 31% to 12? Or what is 9.7 and 7.0? Like, what does that mean? So it helps to add some directionality to the prose so that it makes it effortless for someone to read across it. So that's what I did next. Impact of treating iron deficiency anemia before abdominal surgery. decreased need for blood transfusions, 31% to 12%, shorter hospital length of stay, 9.7 to 7.0, recovery of hemoglobin post-discharge from zero point 0.9 incremental change to 1.9. Almost effortless, just a combination of adding some directional words at the top and adding an arrow to give some directionality about the work. All of a sudden makes it so easy to read this, and it makes it very clear how you should move across the abstract. And then the part that everyone gets so worked up about, that I think is probably the easiest, is adding in some kind of icons. Now, there are all these icon banks, and there are a million icons, and you don't have to troubleshoot this multiple times. I think one of the core design ideas that I emphasized a lot in the primer is that this is a time to just rapidly innovate. Try 20, 30, 40 different icons and just see what happens. So I put those in there. I didn't love them. I didn't think they captured well the ideas that I wanted. So I tried a bunch until I settled on these. And I thought these made a lot more sense and visually communicated much more clearly the ideas that I care about and think are important. And then in, design paranoia, getting things centered, evening out, spacing and margins, also important. So how do you find images? When we first started doing this, Google Icons was one source. And then something that came out was called the Noun Project, which is a data icon, an icon library, where you can pay a small subscription fee, download these icons and use them in your work. Since that time, there are probably no less than 24 icon banks online, many of which are free. You can just search for them. They'll have a lot of the icons that you need for this work. I think one of the most common questions that I get all the time is, are visual abstracts too simple? Are you just like dumbing down the work? And is it almost like offensive that you've taken 5 years of rigorous scientific research and you're now putting it into icons and a yellow background? I love to go back to this article that I wrote with my mentor about how to be a high impact writer. And this is also for free to download on the same website. And it walks you through step by step how to write a high impact research article. But one of the key teaching points of my mentor, Dr. Dimmick, is captured well here by this quote of Oliver Wendell Holmes about clear writing and being simple. And he says, I would not give a fig for simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my life for simplicity on the other side of complexity. In other words, when you're creating your visual abstract, if you just dumb it down to 3 or 4 words and you didn't really think about it, that's not helping anyone. But if you have rigorously thought through the content and you've distilled it to a handful of words that still capture the essence of the work, that's simplicity on the other side of complexity. And that's the kind of simple that I think we should be striving for. So what I want to do, I've walked you through a little bit of the history, how it started. I've told you a little bit about my process and how I do it and how I use the templates. What I want to next do is step back a little bit and take a broader view about visual abstracts, show you a little bit about how it's being used in some traditional and non-traditional ways that maybe will get you excited or help you brainstorm about how it may be relevant or apply to your work. So there's no question it is integrating formally into research curriculums. So at the American College of Surgeons annual health services research course, we teach the visual abstract. At the Association for Academic Surgery, we teach it in the fall courses. At UNC, it's taught in their graduate clinical skills coursework. And at Brown, they have a whole curriculum in design where the visual abstract is also taught. It also has application for lectures. So Dr. Greenberg was the president of the Association of Academic Surgery about 3 years ago and gave this incredible keynote talk about women in academic surgery and a lot of the barriers and how to address them. This talk had people on the edge of their seat, standing ovation, and was just so powerful. And it also been taped. And we were so happy like it was on YouTube. But one of the people who attended, her name was Dr. Chelsea Harris, who's really become one of the real trailblazers in this visual abstract work. She decided this doesn't have to just be for an article. Why couldn't I make a visual abstract about the key points of this talk and then link it to the YouTube link of the talk? So she did, and you could almost watch like as soon as that visual abstract went out for this talk, it took a life of its own, and the views like skyrocketed on YouTube. It almost like gave new life to this talk repeatedly over and over. And Dr. Harris actually went on to develop something called the live visual abstract, where people were recruiting her to meetings to basically make a visual abstract for talks in real time to be shared on social media during the talks. Next is thinking a lot about the audience. When the opioid epidemic struck about 3 years ago, the Annals of Surgery asked Atul Gawande to write a roadmap for what should surgeons do in the context of the opioid crisis, and what are some practical suggestions. So we put that into a visual abstract that had his 6 kind of key points of the article about opportunities for surgeons to improve opioid stewardship. And you could almost watch that in the couple days after this visual abstract was disseminated, it got shared and reshared amongst reporters, and you could like, track it. And then the content wound up in some of the major news outlets. And it's not to say that maybe they wouldn't have found it otherwise, but this certainly made the work more accessible to an audience that cares a lot about getting our important work out to the public. Next, I probably in the first 2 years got like a text message every week with someone taking a photo during one of their lectures, telling me, hey, look, another visual abstract came up. Or it was the presenter saying, thank you so much for creating visual abstracts, because that's just one more slide that I didn't have to make for my talk. It was already made. And some of these are papers that have already been in circulation for a couple of years, but they almost get like a new life of their own because they're brought back into context in this engaging visual format. And then finally, this was a place that I did not see coming. If I could think of a topic that surgeons don't like spend time talking about all the time, if you're just at a water cooler with a bunch of surgeons, I don't think like antibiotic stewardship would sort of be like top on the list. I saw there are a bunch of things in the chat, so I'll come back to that in a couple minutes. I did not think that antibiotic stewardship would be this popular. So there's an article written about 7 recommendations for surgeons to improve antibiotic stewardship, and this quickly became, within 2 weeks, the most shared article that we'd ever created a visual abstract for. And it got me thinking. I got messages from people afterwards, and they said, wouldn't it be great to almost like print this visual abstract out and put it up like at the workstations in the hospital or where clinical providers are sitting, almost as like a visual intervention for improving clinical practice. Pretty powerful, huh? So I will, wrapping up, I want to leave you with kind of 3 ideas for visual abstracts in your work and why I think you should think about it or what you could anticipate. One, there's no question, and this has been repeated in 2 more trials now that I've been a peer reviewer of, that I'm not sure if they're impressed yet, but there's no question that this helps disseminate knowledge. And I think in an era right now where science is being questioned and there's distrust of like scientific facts, I think us as researchers and people who produce scientific knowledge have a bit of a responsibility to make sure that our work is disseminated to people who need it and that it's accessible. 2, I think, is you'll find if you start doing this work, it actually clarifies your message. I can't tell you how many times I did visual abstract workshops in person where people bring, their favorite paper, something they've worked on for years, they're so proud of, and they go through the visual abstract process, and especially those points around clarity and what's your real message. After they had to struggle and wrestle with it in this new format, I said, Andrew, I just realized now like what my work is really about. And I almost wish I could go back and rewrite parts of my article just to emphasize the points that I really care about, that I want to emphasize. And then finally, this idea that a visual is not just a benign version of information, but potentially could inspire behavior change. And so I've had a lot of thoughts and ideas about what are the other ways you could reimagine this visual abstract concept in a larger format that maybe becomes public service announcements. Maybe the next time you go to a park, there's a huge visual abstract that has a public service announcement about ways you can be healthier, et cetera. Maybe it's in the hospital where it's a high traffic area for clinical providers. Maybe it's on elevators where people are just standing there for a couple minutes. I think it actually has real potential to be almost its own intervention. So I'll leave you with this final thought that the 5th edition is in the works. So if you have ideas about how this should develop or content to add, by all means, please reach out and let me know. And with that, I will say thank you and leave my contact information and take some questions. I think we have a bunch of things in the Zoom chat that
I was going to say the chat has been lighting up with some
as well.
thoughts. Yeah. Anthony has asked actually about something that he's worried about, is that the fear that maybe people would just read the visual abstract and not the article. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's no question. I got that criticism a lot in the, are you just creating clickbait, or people just sharing this without even reading it? I think what's important about that is that's a real fear. And we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And part of what was really important about that trial was what I cared most about was people reading the work. And so I think where I hang my hat on that is that more people went to go read the research articles. And so I think it's really important to emphasize that this is not a substitute for the article, but this is really just designed to attract people to try to find the content they want to find. And if it's relevant to them, to go read the article. But by no means is it intended to be a substitute. And I think that we have data that more people go to the article itself when there's a visual abstract. Helps me feel better about the work. But there's no question that is something we thought a lot about, and still is something we try to mitigate, but at least we have evidence that more people are actually reading the work.
There's another comment here around whether or not maybe, like, could you envision how this might work with the journal club? The idea that would it be possible for us to use some of the visual abstracts to either advertise the paper before the critical appraisal, the presentation? Do you know if people are using this visual medium in those ways at all around journal?
Yeah, so I will tell you like the ideal version and like the practical version. The ideal version is something like there's a journal club, and on the handout or the email, you put the 3 visual abstracts, and people are like, oh, those are the 3 articles we're going to discuss at journal club. And it gets them excited and interested, and they go read the article. I think what happened in reality in a number of those scenarios is that a lot of people wanted to come because they're interested in the content, still never read the article, but only read the visual abstract. And so there were kind of like 2 phenomenons about that. One is probably not as many people read the article as idealistically you would have wanted for a journal club. But 2, there's a lot of people who probably wouldn't have come to journal club, or who would have come and just been wallflowers. But within a couple of minutes, they were able to understand the key points of the article, and that allowed them to actually engage in discussion in journal club. So I think it actually is a little bit of a saving grace to engage more people who maybe weren't able to read the full articles, but have ideas or questions about the topic, and the visual abstract at least enables them to have a minimum understanding of the work to engage the conversation.
Just stop your screen share just so that we can have a bigger conversation. There's another comment that around kind of like, depending on the publication, there seems to be different styles. So it looks like there are some visual abstracts that have symbols and images and large text, or some that are a little bit more detailed. So BMJ has the long form, probably more best described as an infographic. I mean,
Yeah.
some of the work that I've done in research has been to say, maybe you need a little bit more space. And so I think that we've tended towards using maybe some infographics, which would be not like, I think of visual abstracts as like the abstract, but some people have turned their whole paper into more of a long form infographic that has multiple panels. And so I thought maybe we could chat a little bit about that. Is there a pro or the con? Do you have different situations where you might look at different formats?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I am a little bit alone on this because a lot of people love the bigger formats.
Mhm.
And like, I toyed with multiple different sizes of visual
Mhm.
abstracts. And part of why I love the size of a PowerPoint slide is there's another design concept we didn't talk about, but it's called thoughtful restraint. And this idea that like when you're constrained, it actually forces you to be more thoughtful. So if you have like unlimited space to put like
Mhm.
tons of content, you're going to put like tons of content. But I think part of what makes a visual abstract effective is being on the other side of complexity and distilling it to a core message. And so I think part of what I love about a smaller space is you don't have a choice. You have to reduce the number of words and content
Mhm.
to get to the core. And actually, when I was at CDC and we workshopped together how CDC was going to create their visual abstracts, CDC took it a step further. And for each section in the visual abstract, they put word limits. And they said,
Mhm.
in this section of visual abstract, no more than 20 words. To
Mhm.
describe the key result finding heading, no more than 12 words. And
Mhm.
they really stuck to it. And their argument was twofold. One was kind of what I echoed to you about the core and getting the essence of a clear idea. But two, they wanted to make sure that their work was accessible to like a sixth grade reader level. That was
Mhm.
their audience. And they said, we can't copy and paste a full paragraph from a scientific journal. We want this to be able to be read to a much broader audience. And so I'm a little biased that I think size constraints is a methodologic advantage.
Mhm.
But I know there are a lot of people who they just love having so much words so much they can't like part with it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that it depends on what you're trying to convey, right? So I think that if you have more than one message you want to convey, if you are trying to just do the abstract to get people there, or if you're actually, for instance, some of the work that I've worked with some of my colleagues to do is around translating guidelines and some of the updates in, let's say, ACLS. And so the idea would be there are 5 updates that they wanted to highlight. So a long form infographic that allows us to have, still short, snappy, but to the point, like smaller panels within to kind of drive home that
Yeah.
point. That's been the preferred stance that the AHA has wanted in their infographics, because they just want people to literally print those out and put them on the wall to remind people these are the 5 changes that we're
Yeah.
endorsing in this round, right? And so I think that again, it doesn't mean that you can't be constrained. It just means that you just have to have a reason, I think,
What's your
why
purpose? Yeah, I
sometimes,
love
right?
it.
So, I mean, I think that the long form, the kind of infographic you have right now is perfect for social sharing. It's the right size. It's the right way to kind of be able to share it around, and so that's fit for purpose. I think that if you are trying to, people also have a lot of posters that they put on walls, and so those are probably more a different format, and so you might have a
Yeah.
different reason for it, right? So I think that's like important to think about what your target audience is. Like you cycled back to that a couple of times. I agree. It's important to keep that group in mind. Here's another interesting comment here. Thanks for a great talk. Do you have any tips on how to become skilled in creating these visual abstracts? And do you have a software choice to create these visual abstracts, e.g. PowerPoint, aside from the platforms that you use, like the icons?
Yeah. Great. Two really great questions. So the visual abstract primer has gotten up to 55 pages and has a bunch of tips and tricks about kind of like how to hone in your craft. I think one of the most high yield concepts or ideas that is so hard for us in clinical medicine and research is this idea of rapid innovation. None of us like to be wrong. That's like not like none of us go to clinic being like, I hope I'm wrong 9 out of 10 times today. Like no one says that. Like, right, you want to be right 10 out of 10 times. But if you're actually trying to be really innovative and creative, if you're right 10 out of 10 times, you're not being innovative or creative. And so I think one of the mental hurdles you need to potentially get over when you're doing visual abstracts is to rapidly innovate. It's almost like throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. So when I make a visual abstract, I probably go through like 20 iterations in like a half hour. Like I'll swap something out, I'll change a font, I'll move something in, and I'll just keep doing it until like something sticks. And then what you really want to do as you're doing that is ideally have one or two people with you who are just an audience. And so you're just in a room, you can project it or maybe virtual. And as you're making these changes, like get real-time feedback. People will be like, oh, that color's too bright, like tone that down. But you just have to be comfortable enough that you're going to get like a lot of negative until you find the sweet spot. So I think
Um,
that is probably at the core is like jumping into the deep end and like, it's all right. You're going to sink a few times before you swim. And then your question about PowerPoint. So it's a great question. So obviously I train in design. So I have the whole Adobe Shop suite and the whole thing and the bells and whistles. And I started in Photoshop and then I went to Adobe Photoshop and then I went to, or I started in PowerPoint and I went to Adobe. And one of the problems I had is in something like Photoshop, there's like too many options. There's like a million things you can do, and it actually like disables you a little bit. It actually freezes you because you were like, which one of these 50 options am I going to use to center the font? And like in PowerPoint, it's like one option. So in the spirit of like clarity of purpose and thoughtful restraint, I actually went back to PowerPoint to force myself to work within constraints. I thought it made me actually much more effective.
yeah, that's great. And I guess there's another question just quickly that says, is a visual abstract just a format of infographic? Would you be able to kind of elaborate on basically what worked in favor of kind of the format that you ended up going kind of a flat design, like bright colors, high contrast, that kind of thing, versus other kind of more complex ones, like the ones that you saw
Yeah.
the CDC did and things like that, right?
Yeah, so there are like
Mhm,
6 formats
mhm.
in the Visual Abstract Primer. Maybe let me see if I can pull it up and I'll share screen again for a second. Give me 1 second. So there were about 20 designs that we went through and got down to about these 6. So Visual Abstract Primer. So I love this because now it's like 12 other people like weighed in and these contributors. But let me skim down to these different formats and just show you a couple different things. So part of our key questions when we were picking these different templates, so here's kind of alternative layouts. There's kind of a couple core questions. When you're going to try a new layout, there's a couple tests that you want to do with a focus group. So you want to show your new layout to someone, have them look at it for about 30 seconds. And there's some really important questions you want to ask. The first one is, did you know where to look? Was it obvious to you that you were supposed to start here and then go to here and then go here? Like, was it obvious to you, or did you end up looking around in circles 3 times? That's the first question I always ask is, did you know where to look? The second question I always ask is, did you have to stop anywhere? In other words, did you kind of move along through the visual abstract and then like something just didn't make sense and it like stopped you? Those are the 2, I think, most high yield questions to evaluating design when you're trying a new design or a new concept. And I think about that road in Colorado where it's just like crystal clear where you're supposed to go, no left, no right, just straight. Your audience should have the same feeling and response when they look at your visual abstract. So these are all ones that we did that we piloted and were able to find that like people could look at these and know what to do. So anyway,
They can
there's
follow
certainly
them
not the
well.
only
Yeah,
one. There's definitely more effective layouts. I think those are two good guiding questions as you kind of evaluate, is this working or not working?
that's great. We have just a little bit of time left, but I was just wondering, you had offered when we were going back and forth a little bit whether or not a demo might be possible.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's something that even just to kind of go through and show people kind of like one of those PowerPoint slides just so that they can see kind of not necessarily the magic happen in real time, but even just like pulling one up so that they can see how it's like a little bit constructed, because I think that's a bit of the intimidation that people have with this. Would that be
Yeah. I
possible?
also have like a mini video I can play too.
Yeah, sure. If you want to just make sure you
Let me
optimize the
see.
video. That
Let
might
me
be
see
good
if
when you screen share again. You just have to make sure you check the optimized video in the bottom left-hand corner and the share sound.
I got asked this question a lot.
Mhm.
So I end up recording kind of my desktop in real time. So this is a
Yeah,
little video of sort of creating a visual abstract.
yeah,
And
nice.
so this is like from pure, just like a blank PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So the first move is actually just like boxes.
Can you do us
It's
a
not
favor? Can
that
you just
fancy.
full
It's
screen that
actually
for
like
us?
embarrassingly simple
Yeah,
of creating visual fields,
very
just
cool.
using different color boxes.
Perfect.
Let me
Yeah.
backtrack. So the first thing I did was literally just make a visual fields, which was pretty um, almost like embarrassingly simple for what's involved. And it's cool. You can tweak the sizes, bigger a little, smaller a little, play with the different shades of colors that you want to like use, and kind of work from there. The next thing I do is, as I told you before, as simple as just adding in the title and citation. Like I add kind of the key stuff that is like I know needs to be there. And then, you're going to tweak the size a little bit, be like, all right, the title took a little more space. I got to line up my boxes now. And then, my little OCD of making things evenly spaced. And then adding the key findings. So I think like the hard part is finding out like what are your key findings. That's more like the pros that I think takes more time. And so I think a lot of people at this point, this is where they get stuck. And it's like they haven't taken the time to like really digest the paper and say like what are the key points and what are the supporting data for that. And then once you get the key content in, then I think the design part is like fun, and you'll like find the icons that you want to put. I kind of was like had fun with this administrative duties, and I was like, when you're complaining about paperwork, you kind of just feel like it's piling on. And so I couldn't find like a pile of administrative stuff stacking, but I was like, I certainly know how to use the crop function. And then all of a sudden, you're like, oh yeah, that is paperwork just piling up. So that's kind of like the nuts and bolts of it, like in PowerPoint. That is just like, I think like pretty simple.
Yeah, that's
That
wonderful.
sort of hopefully makes it like less intimidating.
Yeah.
That it's literally just text and some color boxes.
Yeah. And I find, like you said, the really hard part is actually getting your message down enough so that you can make it simple. And so I think that taking some time to actually do that is worthwhile. And what you can do is you can actually, I actually, when I teach this, because I have taught it to some people at conferences and stuff, is get a piece of paper, like fold it in half,
Yeah.
right? And then like do it with pen and paper and stick figures first, because the most important thing actually is the words. And if you can get your words down, and you can use pencil so you can erase it, and like back
Yeah.
in grade 4 when you were doing sketches and stuff like that, like nothing is set in stone, and you can actually just do some of that thing. And then what you can do is you can actually sketch it out, and then once you have your vision in mind, then building the boxes, finding the right icons, that's just more searching through. I think you mentioned Noun Project, which is great because Noun Project has lots of open access
Yeah.
icons and stuff like that. But there's lots of different places that you can find those. I have subscription. I have a subscription to PictoChart, which for the educator's license is 35
Yeah.
bucks for like a year, which I love to use to make figures for my papers and stuff like that too. So I would highly recommend just taking a step back and like whatever modality you're most comfortable with. But I actually just like using pen and paper because I think it just simplifies things and you're not working so hard.
Yeah, Joel Tope, who's a nephrologist in Michigan, he loves the pen and paper. He had a couple tweets where he like showed his progression of like it almost looks like he's like sketching it on a napkin, and then he like formalizes the drawing, and then he builds it out in PowerPoint. One thing I didn't show you in that slide deck, but almost all of my visual abstracts that I created, the final visual abstract is one slide, but in the column, I probably have like 15 slides of like different things I tried. And I try not to delete them. If the thing doesn't work, I just copy the slide down and then change it. And then I copy the slide down and change something else. And because sometimes you want to go back and be like, oh, let me go back to that thing and like try to bring that back. Or you can kind of see the progression of your work evolving, and it kind of helps you understand why you got to where you were and what worked or didn't. So you should, if you're trying to do this, have like 20 slides you don't want to show anyone, and then like one really good one. So don't be
Yeah.
don't like hide your work. Don't shove it under the rug. Just embrace it as part of the process.
I feel like we're kindred spirits because that's exactly what I do. I replicate my picture chart, down things, and I just go to the next one, go to the next one. And another collaborative tool would be if you are a collaborative person and you are working with other people on your infographic, then I would hop on Google Slides these days, actually not even use PowerPoint. It's the same functionality, and four of you can be moving and putting in a new icon and
Oh,
things like
cool.
that. And I think that would be a really fun way
I've never
to do
tried that.
something
That
like
sounds
that.
super cool.
Yeah, definitely check it out if you're able to do that. But I think that's really important. Oh, and here's another question. So Anthony's asking, are there any hints on how to tweet these out once they're created? Like what to include in the tweet?
Oh yeah. So you should definitely include the hashtag visual abstract,
Yes.
because a lot of people actually use that to try to find visual abstracts. So there was some talk at some point that it kind of fizzled out a little bit, but we had talked to like PubMed about adding a visual abstract filter so that if a visual abstract was included in the article, you could filter that way to find visual abstracts. That kind of fell through, but it'd be interesting to do. I think a couple things you definitely want to stick to. One is, because you want this to just be a preview of the work, this should not be a standalone thing and should have a link to the article. That sounds like really obvious, but actually a lot of people, especially early on, were just sending out all these visual abstracts and no one knew what article it went to. And that like definitely wasn't a good look, because it's kind of like, what do you mean it's not a substitute for the article? People are just sharing the abstract and no one even knows which article it is. So definitely include a link to the article. And then if you're planning on sharing on social media, the size thing starts to really matter. I think if you do those long vertical formats, they don't tend to do super well in social media because you have to open it to see it. So sticking to a PowerPoint slide configuration is very favorable, because usually people can see the whole slide without having to click on it. So when they're just scanning, it'll kind of help them do that. So I'd say include a link for the article and stick to a horizontal configuration.
Yeah, actually, that's the nice thing about some of the programs like Picture Chart now. It's actually got a panel where it gives you the actual graphic, the size that Twitter wants it to be.
Oh,
And it
good.
makes it a lot easier because you can start with that template and then you can build from there, similar to what you did. And that's very helpful. Here's another question from Michael. As well as the ability of visual abstracts to clearly improve article dissemination, what are your thoughts on the impact of visual abstracts on improving readers' comprehension of the article? Have you been using any of your
Yeah.
infographic kind of mojo in your
So
papers these days?
this trial is not public yet, I don't think. I believe it was accepted, so I'll just cautiously tell you the findings. But a group of, I think, emergency medicine doctors, no less, they took a bunch of medical students and they randomized them to either a text abstract or a visual abstract. They gave them pizza for like a half hour, and then they quizzed them on the content of the article. And they found that people who read the visual abstract retained more information. So it's kind of fascinating if that's true. It was like a small sample. I think it was like 50 or 60 students, but there probably is something to that, at least for some people. Now we should be like thoughtful and considerate that not everyone's a visual learner, and this may be a disadvantage for people who are either visually impaired or who don't visually process things. But I think there certainly is some subset of an audience where a visual format may actually be a great way to comprehend work that may be more effective. When I think about like the textbooks that I read all the time, I think I wish they came in like a visual abstract format on every page.
So I'm just going to tell a story
Yeah.
about this paper that went round and round with revisions with my editors at this journal. And until I put in this, it's a long form infographic about our methods, they weren't getting it. And I was like, you know what, it's time. I'm going to start using my visual abstract infographic mojo. And I put one of these guys in, and then the next round it was accepted. I don't know if it's because we were just more clear on our writing as well, but they actually said in their comment back, the infographic was super helpful for us to understand the methods. And so the idea would be, I think the power of visual media to do some of this stuff, to actually convey something really well, we had 3 different steps to our study, and they were getting lost in that. And so by doing this, we were like, before the project, step 1, step 2, step 3. And with that success, actually, I've actually started using visual abstracts in my grants to help guide grant readers through kind of a complex more methods or multi-phase kind of program of research. And I don't know, the last 2 won. So I 100% batting average or 1,000 batting average right now.
I love it.
So I do think that there's role to think about that, right? I mean, have we got a randomized control trial of giving our national granting agency people visual abstracts or not for the grants? Not yet, but maybe someday that would be something we'd be bold enough to do, right? And try to figure out whether or not people would be more inclined to grant something that was understandable at a glance, right? And so I think, yeah, right?
Just before COVID happened, I got invited to give a talk to like a neuroscience institute whose entire lab is dedicated to like neurocognitive development from visual stimuli. And they were like, we want to like get really into the deep of visual abstracts and how like the neurocognitive science can help explain why some of your visual abstracts get comprehended or don't. And I was like, oh my God, there are people who like think about this. And then like COVID happened and like all bets were off. And I was like, oh my gosh, that would have been so cool. So
you should still reach out to them. Your stuff translates really well digitally, so I would recommend that you could definitely zoom with them for now and see, because I think that a big part of it is that the science of it probably makes sense for some parts, to simplify things, to guide people, to walk them through. But yeah, I think that'll be interesting. Michael's follow-up is that would this be a central focus of visual abstracts to maybe think about that comprehension part, or do you think that it'll always remain about a dissemination strategy, or do you think that
I love the comprehension part. You would like sing songs of joy to a journal editor if you could demonstrate that a visual abstract helps with retention of the content. Like, oh my God, every journal editor would love that. They would do like backflips. So that would be great if that's true. So I support if we can figure out how to do it.
Well, Michael's an undergrad student, so lots of time to think, Michael. Maybe
No
this is a
pressure,
thesis
Michael.
project. No, just kidding. But definitely, like, I mean, I think it's exciting for us to think about this stuff. I think it's probably a challenge for us to think about in terms of knowledge translation. And finally, I think that the other part of it too is that there are probably other parts of what we do that are so opaque and so complex that if you can drop it into a diagram, it actually might help with that communication, retention, and then understanding part, which I think is what Visual Abstracts has really brought about, is that it decreases cognitive load, it makes it more understandable. If the study that you've reviewed recently holds true and replicates several times, then it may have actual retention outcomes too, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's very promising. Mhm. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight,
Yeah, for
virtually,
sure.
to
Thanks for
hang out.
hosting me.
And
I'm
you
so
know,
pumped to tweet this out to be like the borders may be closed, but education is not.
you got it. And
Totally
if there's any
fantastic.
ever a time that you want to come back again, you let us know. If you
Totally.
ever want, obviously Dolly from London, or
I love it.
or Anthony from GW, then obviously they've all been here tonight, and hopefully we can return the favor with you. So
Yeah, sounds
definitely
wonderful.
come and
Thanks again for
hang out with
organizing,
us.
Teresa, and thanks everyone for being thoughtful and engaged.
Yeah.